Hello and welcome to today's daily market brief. You ever get that feeling where you're reading the headlines and they're all screaming one thing, but what you're seeing around you feels, well, different? Today, we are diving right into that gap, that huge chasm between the story we're told about the economy and what the numbers are actually saying.
And to kick things off, I've got a fantastic Spanish word for you, papa huevos. Now, it literally means something like egg swallower, which is kind of funny, but it describes someone who is really gullible. You know, a person who just believes everything they hear without question. And that really sets up our big question for today. When it comes to the economy, are we all being just a little bit of a papa huevos?
So first up, let's unpack this narrative of fear. Because let's be real, it is powerful, it is absolutely everywhere, and it's shaping how millions of us feel about our own financial futures. Okay, now take a look at this chart. This is just wild. According to the University of Michigan's Big Consumer Survey, the level of fear people have about the economy right now, it's at the same level as the 2008 global financial crisis and the absolute darkest days of the pandemic. Just let that sink in for a second. People feel as bad today as they did during two of the worst crises in modern history. That is an incredibly gloomy outlook. And just to be crystal clear, this isn't just a little bit of anxiety. People aren't just thinking, oh, maybe a small recession is coming. No. What the data is telling us is that the public is genuinely bracing for a massive, historic, maybe even a once-in-a-century kind of economic meltdown. So who's feeling this fear the most? Well, it's pretty widespread, right, across all age groups. But here's the twist. The surveys show it's actually the middle and high-income folks who are the most pessimistic. It's this really weird paradox, but maybe it makes a certain kind of sense, you know? The more you have to lose. Okay, so we've heard the story, we've felt the fear. But now, let's pull back the curtain and look at the actual numbers, because they tell a completely different story. So even with all this historic fear swirling around, the Atlanta Fed is tracking the U.S. economy as growing at a solid 2%. Now, for a big developed economy, 2% growth is, well, it's good, it's healthy, it's stable. It is definitely not the sign of an impending collapse. And right there, that's our first huge disconnect between the narrative and the numbers. And look, yeah, short-term inflation is real. We all feel that pain, right? At the grocery store, at the gas pump. But here's the thing. The number that really matters for long-term economic stability, what people expect inflation to be in 5 years, that is holding remarkably steady. It suggests the market thinks this current spike is a temporary problem, not some permanent, terrible new reality. Which brings us to the biggest puzzle of all. If everyone is so terrified, if they're expecting the worst crisis in 100 years, then why is everyone still, well, buying stuff? Why hasn't consumer spending just fallen off a cliff? And the answer seems to be something called a K-shaped economy. This chart just lays it out perfectly. Check this out. The wealthiest 20% of the population, they are responsible for a whopping 60% of all consumer spending. Their spending power is so enormous that it can prop up the whole economy, making the top-line numbers look good, even if the other 80% of people are really feeling the pinch. And that is the absolute key takeaway here. The big picture economic data, the GDP numbers we see on the news, they can totally hide the real anxiety that the vast majority of the population is feeling. It's like one group's spending is papering over the struggles of another. You know, this whole clash between the popular story and the hard data, it's not just an American thing. We see this pattern playing out all over the world. Let's take a look at another perfect example of this exact same dynamic, the global story around green energy. Just look at Europe. Germany has been praised for years as this green energy trailblazer, right? The story was they'd make a smooth switch from nuclear to renewables. But the reality? Well, after spending 500 billion euros, their energy supply is actually less stable, and prices have more than doubled. Meanwhile, in France, the energy giant Total Energies just quietly walked back its big zero emissions promise. The narrative is really hitting a wall. And it's a similar story when you look at China. The narrative we hear all the time is how China is leading the world in solar and wind. And sure, they're building a lot of it. But the data also shows they are in the middle of a massive expansion of coal-fired power plants, the single most carbon-heavy energy source on the planet. So once again, the story and the numbers are telling two very different tales. So what's the bottom line here? What are we supposed to do with all this? How do we even operate in a world where the most popular stories just don't seem to match the facts on the ground?
Well, the takeaway is to develop a really simple habit of critical thinking. It's a 3-step framework. First, figure out what the dominant story is. What's everyone saying? Second, go looking for the numbers that challenge that story. And third, this is the most important part. Ask why. Why does that gap between the story and the data exist? Because that's where you'll find the real insight.
At the end of the day, this is not about ignoring fear or telling people their concerns aren't valid. Not at all. It's about empowering yourself with a more complete picture. It's about looking past the scary headlines so you can really understand the complex forces at play, instead of just swallowing the first story you're fed.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought. In the financial markets, and frankly in life, the biggest opportunities are almost always found in that gap between perception and reality. The next time you see one of those panicked headlines, ask yourself, are you just seeing fear, or are you seeing an opportunity that everyone else is missing?